Last session of the day is Dr. Edward Mills, who's here now, and we've been chatting for a little bit. Ed is a current postdoctoral research associate in Exeter's Department of Modern Languages and Cultures, working on the AHRC-funded Learning French in Medieval England podcast. Ed has a wide variety of conference experience, both in person and online, including both presenting this morning, as you may have heard, but also presenting aptly named Academics in Quarantine online conference series.
Oh.
yeah.
Good spot. I missed that. What about that?
So effective pedagogy has been at the centre of much of Ed's academic career so far, and he's built a reputation as an excellent communicator in numerous and various settings. Ed's session is on delivering impactful conference presentations in a blended digital face-to-face academic environment. So it really brings together the two halves of the workshop that we've had so far, the kind of academic and procedural side, but also the practical side. Ed's going to give us some tips and tricks on, how to do a really core part of the job. I'm really excited to learn from Ed's experiences, so I'll hand over to him and stop talking.
Thanks. That's a really generous introduction. I didn't write that, did I?
That was all me.
Yeah, because that would have been, that's very kind of you. So hello, everybody. Lovely to see you all virtually. And thanks for having me. As Benedict said, I have presented, I'm old enough to remember a time before digital conferences. But over the last sort of year and a half, I've done quite a few online conferences. And it's important to note that I call this workshop today Effective Conference Presentations Online and Off. The reason for that is there's a huge amount of overlap between this. And I don't want you to go away from today thinking that everything you're going to hear is only applicable in a digital context. Many of the things that we're learning today are actually applicable in face-to-face as well. And you'll see from the sort of the right hand of the mural document that we're going to do a little exercise later where we talk about what the differences are between in-person and remote conferences, but there'll be an awful lot of similarity between them as well. Unless I've misunderstood things here, most of you have been to a conference. A sizable number of you have presented at a conference, but many of you haven't presented in a digital space before. I've assumed, therefore, by the way, that if you have been to a conference, if you've presented at a conference, you've also been to one. That's really useful to know. The closest thing we'll come to a kind of didactic model here will be a couple of general rules for conference presentations. But then towards the end, I want to talk a bit more about digital specifically. Yeah, I can see people have, looking at the responses here, people have said things like keeping that personal exchange we have in in-person conferences, learning about digital environments and tips and tricks with them, and looking as well about how things have changed. So someone said that when they started, I've got that just up here, they presented on an OHP and had to have the slides printed. I like that. I remember that as well. And there's certainly things that we can change about that. So my question to you to start us off today is, those of you who've been to conferences before, what really, for want of a better term, I'm going to apologize for slightly blue language here, what really pissed you off? You can either type this or raise your hand. I'd love to hear from people, but what really irritates you when you're at a conference? It can be in person or it can be online. I don't mind either. People asking questions to look clever. Yes, absolutely. I'm assuming not finding the hand is something that you can't find it rather than that irritating you, but I'll go with that. Yeah. Reading straight off slides. Yep, absolutely. Anything else? Let's see what else. Not enough time for questions and networking. Yeah. Conferences, just while these are coming in, can be really frustrating things. It has to be said. We've all got used to Zoom over the last 12 months or so. But so many people seem to think that a conference is a seminar paper, and that yes, another one there from Chrissy, technical information in jargon. and that a Zoom conference is the same as an in-person conference. It really isn't. Too many presentations going on at the same time, unable to attend all of them. Yes, although this is something that digital conferences that is changing. I should perhaps explain what I mean when I talk about a digital conference. You can have, for example, an in-person asynchronous conference. That's perhaps the hardest one to get. You could have a remote synchronous one. Anna, is it to do with live or pre-recorded talks? Yes. Which axis would that be, do you think? Almost all presentations will fall, some panels or conferences will fall somewhere on this kind of group of 4, if you like. So live or pre-recorded, which axis is that, X or Y? I'll just let you type that for a second. But would someone be able to explain what, say, a remote synchronous conference might involve? What might that look like? Yes, Claire, go ahead.
Basically, a remote synchronous conference would be one that happens at a set time.
Yep.
That you would tune into, but that you wouldn't necessarily have access to after that point in time.
Ooh, that's a really interesting point. It's less to do with what you have afterwards. It's more to do with how the papers are presented. Does anyone think they know what I might mean by that? I'm being a little bit vague here deliberately. So an online conference will usually be hosted on something like Zoom. And depending on how fancy it is, you may have a sort of a second platform. There's one going on at the moment that I was at this morning, which is using a platform called Pathable to organize sessions. And it's got 2,000 attendees, so it's worth it for that sort of size. But with Zoom, of course, you can record a presentation live. So whether or not it's available afterwards, that could actually depend. You could have that either way. Synchronous or asynchronous refers to something else. Any ideas here? Claire, go ahead.
Synchronous is that it's at a given time. Asynchronous is that you can access it at any point in time.
Sort of. You're correct with respect to half of it. And I think Anna's hit the nail on the head in the chat there. She said it could be live or pre-recorded. I've seen several variants of conference. There was one conference that ran earlier this year, which would be, you'd call it a remote asynchronous conference. What that means is people pre-record their video, their presentation, you watch them beforehand, and then everybody gathers for discussion and comments. You may have seen the kind of live version of this, which was pre-pandemic. People would upload or people would send a script out beforehand. Rather than going into it section by section, what might some of the advantages be of asynchronous conferences like that? Ones where the presentation is pre-recorded or ones where it's sent out in advance? What might be good about that?
The presenters don't overrun.
Ooh, not necessarily. You'd be very surprised. Like if you're being asked to send in a video presentation, you'd be amazed. People can still overrun. It's very much possible. Better quality rehearsed talks. When you say better quality, Cassandra, what do you mean, if you don't mind me asking? Because I think we can talk about quality in several ways. But we'll come back to that in a moment. What about in-person presentations? Whether that's synchronous presentations. Oh yes, I've just seen that, Claire. Yeah, allow people to access. Okay, I'll deal with this first. Yeah, so Claire's saying allow people to access the presentations when they want to. Yeah, absolutely. You'll often be told, can you watch these presentations beforehand and then come along to the session to discuss them, or can you read it beforehand and then come along to the session if it's in person? Easier to appear more professional. Yes, that's something we'll come back to. Coherent, watchable, rewindable. Yes. And Benedict, you've got another point there. It's very rare to have a conference without a synchronous element to it. Rebecca, time zones. Yes, absolutely. So lots of really, really good things here. I wanted to, last minute minor adjustments. Yes, that's an advantage of the synchronous model. There's one big advantage of the asynchronous model. You may have done slightly, yeah. There's one big advantage of the asynchronous model, though, which people often overlook. And that's the fact that whether you're in person or remote, you can start with questions. People will have read or watched, depending on how you had to submit your paper already. Which brings us on to the second main point I want to raise today. I know we've got a fairly short amount of time in the 20 minutes, the sort of 40 minutes or so we've got left. But there are some general rules for conferences, which I think it's worth bearing in mind. The first one, why? In person or remote, why do we go to conferences? What's the point? This is rule one for me in conferences, wherever it sits on this sort of matrix of four, in-person, remote, synchronous, or asynchronous, is why are we bothering? What's the point? Learn stuff, okay? Yeah. So learn, share, and network. This is really interesting because I've noticed this is SPA, isn't it, Benedict? Is that right? Connections and networking is a much bigger point than I've seen elsewhere. Discover new people. Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of other points I've not seen implemented. To share, receive knowledge, research. Yep, absolutely. There's an interesting point about sharing knowledge there. One of the links I'll be sharing towards the end of this session talks about conferences as places to road test ideas. One thing I'm really glad that people have not said is that conferences are a place to show off or to grandstand. Because however annoying some people can appear at conferences, if they're trying to do that, those people are forgetting that conferences are a great place to share feedback and to get feedback on work in progress. For me, a good conference presentation is one that invites questions. And I think that's a key point to take away. Digital or online, or not digital, a conference presentation that has no questions at the end is one that's missing out on an opportunity. It could be a great paper. You might be unlucky in that you've not got the right audience. But that brings us on to a second key point for conference presentations, which is consider your audience. So what might your audience be at a conference paper? That's something like the Inspiration Conference that's coming up in October, which you're all attending, I believe, right? What's the audience there? Who's going to be there? PGRs, okay, yeah, other academics and undergrad. Okay, so undergrads as well. So how does it, are they going to be specialists in your discipline? PGTs, yeah. No, okay, so you've got, and how might that make a difference to you? I'll give a good example of this. This is coming from my field, but this morning I was presenting at the International Medieval Congress, okay? 2 months ago, I was presenting at a conference called Medieval French Without Borders. So compare those two, International Medieval Congress versus Medieval French Without Borders. Which of those is going to have a more knowledgeable audience, do you think? Or a more specific audience? Yes, the second one, absolutely. So this is an important thing to note. This is not your conference coming up. It's not the international conference in, I don't know, Benedict Lane's PhD field specialism. Or,
that would be great though.
Yeah, or Dorothea's research, or Louise Toller's PhD. It's not that kind of conference. So what that means is you've got to think, okay, how can I get useful feedback out of this? And you need to tailor your presentation in order to make that work. You need to encourage questions and think, okay, so what would an interested non-expert be useful for? How can I use this room of people who are going to listen to me for 20 minutes? Obviously, I can't make very specific points about implications of my data, but I might be able to ask broader questions about, say, methodology, for example, which non-specialists could usefully say something on. And that's my second key point to raise. After that first one, why are you presenting? It's think about who your audience actually is. I asked earlier what annoys people when they were doing conferences. And I want to be a bit mean here. And would someone be willing to demonstrate the worst conference paper they have ever seen for me? Ideally with video. No worries if video is not possible. You should be able to do it with voice only. Is anyone here willing to step up and be deliberately terrible for me? If we're all a bit shy, that is okay.
I just want to add, it's like, I don't have the paper, but it's really annoying when the people can't speak actually. So you have difficulties to follow what they're saying. And I know that speaking is sort of a skill that you learn, or some are just natural speakers, but it's really good if people pay attention, because all this and what I want to say here is super annoying and distract. So if you're gonna present an idea, obviously that's the point to present it. And I know that people feel stressed very often, but that's super annoying.
Yeah, let's assume we've got a 20-minute period. We're either recording a video, if we're doing something asynchronously, or we are standing up in front of a live audience and speaking. In the final part today, we'll look a bit more at how you can record video well. I know that Tom Nicholas has already talked about that quite a lot. But whether we are in front of a live audience or we are speaking to a camera, there are a few things that many people actually hate. Excuse me, one moment. As it happens, I've not yet thrown away my notes from this morning. Therefore, I'd like to invite you to imagine that it is 4 p.m. on day one of an international conference. People are still getting in the zone a little bit. They've been staring at their screens for 7 hours. But this would also be applicable to somebody who's been sitting in a slightly warm room with slightly bad coffee for 7 hours. Someone stands up, gets the introduction and says, thank you. It has typically been suggested that the majority of readings of Walter de Bibbsworth's treatise tend to be of an onomastic nature. That is to say, they tend to focus on the study of who's already asleep. Quite possibly most people. And what I would suggest very strongly to you all is that conferences are not book chapters. The conference is a genre exactly like a book chapter is, with its own requirements. And while we don't have time to look into all of this today, it's really important to bear in mind that you are writing something you're going to be speaking, rather than something that you are going to be sending to people. If the exception to this on that kind of four-way diagram that we had earlier, yeah, Rebecca, I get that as well. And yes, Claire, you're absolutely right. That actually is a challenge with digital conferences, and we'll come back to that in a minute if you haven't got that sort of immediate feedback from the audience. But you're producing something that you're going to be speaking. If you are involved in an older style conference, I would call this in-person asynchronous, going on that matrix, because traditionally that would involve sending in a bit of text. So there might be an exception there, because the way that you read something that is written down is very different from the way in which you present something or have something presented to you. But you're producing something. You're producing something which you need to be familiar with, but which you're trying to share with people. And as soon as you go down like this, and you are reading something that could easily be something that were published in a journal, you might be saving yourself some work in the long run, but you're not going to get anything out of that conference presentation. I personally always like to have to road test stuff, and I have had entire chapters of my PhD in conference paper form about 2 years before I had them in actual PhD written form. So it's really worth thinking about what you want to get out of it, and remembering that conferences are not book chapters. There's one other final point I would make before I want to move on to some of the more technical stuff for the final part of our session. I'm going to leave sort of 10 minutes at the end for questions, if that's okay. Oh, Claire, you auditioned and acted in a play before you presented at a national conference. Would you be willing to say a bit more about that, if that's okay? How did that help you? Because I've done a bit of acting as well. Stand-up comedy. Oh, I want to hear this. Right. So Claire, how did acting help?
It was very useful. I hope I'm coming through.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. It was exceptionally useful. I was literally petrified because I'd been told that I would be presenting to an audience of about 70 professionals that were highly trained in the field that I was going to talk to them about. And I realized that I really needed to become practiced and comfortable just being up in front of people, but also sharing information in a way that I was able to come across with authority, but also not be too presumptuous, because I was a sort of newbie in the field. And I happened to live in a community that had auditions for a play, got one of the leading roles. And after I'd done that, I no longer was nervous about presenting, but I also realized that it was a bit of give and take between the presenter and the audience, rather than it simply being the presenter that was totally responsible. And I think that's the difficulty sometimes with online asynchronous conferences, that you can't actually gauge your audience. But I also think that it made me put much less on my slides and really emphasize passion and interest in what I was doing.
Absolutely. Can I ask if you have anything to add on that? Is it Tiamat? Apologies for mispronouncing your name there. Because you mentioned stand-up comedy helped you. Was that going to it or doing it?
Oh, I mean, I don't know if going to would probably help as well, but like doing stand-up comedy, actually going up on stage. And I think it's like the most brutal form of preparation. I mean, like I started doing it like 2.5 years ago, like right before my PhD. And I was sort of like, oh gosh, I'm gonna do the PhD and then you're gonna have to go and talk at conferences and stuff. And I was sort of like, my little toe was getting in the water. And then with stand-up comedy, it felt like one of those big like Russian guys jumping into the cold ocean in preparation. Like it was just so like the other extreme from what I thought I needed. And I would recommend, like, if folks just go to a local comedy club, like they're everywhere, just think of even some knock jokes or something, as long as they're original. And yeah, I think it just really gets you comfortable with setting up a punchline or stating an opinion or just being on stage with lights and people staring at you and them not laughing and then still being like, haha, anyway, and just moving on. And I think with conferences, it's like not about maybe the laughter, but at least that sort of that reaction of just being okay and being on stage. So yeah, that definitely really helped me. I did have a bit of that conscious thing as well as like preparation for academia, and then I just stayed because it was fun. But if anyone wanted to do that as like actually just going once or twice to sort of throw yourself into the cold ocean of presenting, maybe that would help you too.
I actually really like the idea of points that you're making in your presentation as punchlines.
Yeah.
Because they're things that you set up, right? They're things that you prepare. They're things that you ready the audience for. And if you think about how you tell a joke, the amount of care that has to go into crafting it, right? it reflects the way that you cannot just make a point and chuck it away in a presentation. This might sound quite high level and quite abstract to people, but I think it's a really important point to make. And it comes back to something that I think Claire mentioned a second ago. Was it you, Claire, who talked about how the give and take and how you don't see your audience when you're presenting digitally?
Yes, I think that can be really hard if you haven't presented before. I think the longer that you do it, and I also teach online as well, asynchronously. So trying to create opportunities for engagement within what you're saying. But I also think you have to turn to psychology and think that if you are presenting for more than a certain amount of time and you're putting too much up on your screen, no one's paying attention.
No.
So it has to be very, very minimal. And I remember giving one of the best presentations. It was an hour and a half long session. An hour was the presentation, and I used 6 slides.
Yeah.
And each slide had no more than 5 lines on.
That's solid.
Yeah, it gives you that opportunity to, if you know your subject well, and that's the key, to improvise on the spot and add in what you see as necessary for those people. Much harder online, asynchronously. Yeah.
Now, that actually brings me quite neatly, I'll come back to this point in a minute, but that brings me quite neatly onto the challenges of presenting digitally. Everything that we've said thus far is largely applicable to in-person or to digital. But I suspect, based on the responses that I saw in the mural document earlier, a lot of people are here to find out about how you can do things different digitally, which is what I want to talk about just in the sort of the final 10 minutes I have before we open up to discussion. Claire made the really, really good point that I'm really grateful to you for making, that you don't have that live feedback with an audience. Let's imagine though that you're in a live presentation. Let's say it's 2 years ago, or hopefully next year, you know, touch wood. And you can present. Let's say you've got a live audience with you. What kind of live feedback might you get from them? What are you imagining you might see people doing if they're struggling, say, with something that you're saying? Yeah, glaze over, yawn. I don't know if people are doing that now because people don't have their cameras on, and that's a really interesting point to note with online presentations. Sleeping, talking among themselves, yeah, absolutely. And you can't tell any of this stuff. Looking at their phone is a big one. Although they might be tweeting, that's worth noting. Not being responsive, yeah. I've seen people go before. There's one person who I know is notorious for falling asleep in long, hot, stuffy panels, looking on Facebook. Yeah, all of these things are things people can do. And you can't tell whether people are doing that or not in many online presentations, whether they are pre-recorded and sent in. And of course, if that's the case, people may be doing other things in the background, or if they're live. What I thought might be a useful thing to do would be to show you my slides from this morning. Not all of them, but just to give you a sense of how you can structure digital first, I'm going to call it, slides. I actually did this in the traditional way this morning, which was PowerPoint and screen. Well, actually it was PDF of slides and screen share, because you can never be quite certain how PowerPoints will show up on different computers. But I'm just going to share my screen now, just to show you what my slides looked like. And you'll see actually that unconsciously, I've kind of followed many of the same rules that were mentioned earlier with not having too much on the page. But there's another thing that I want to suggest you try in your next presentations to support your audience. One thing we can do is use less text on our slides. That's really important. But I also want to draw your attention to this, which is something I've started doing, which I find really, really useful. What do you think you can't see my slides yet, can you? Yeah, you can. What do you think I'm referring to when I say this? I'll just flick through them and you'll start to hopefully get a sense of it. You may see my comments. Presentation progress bar. Yes. That's something I would strongly recommend you try in your presentations. That's exactly what this is. In technical terms, what's going on here is it's basically a bunch of text boxes with different color fills in them. And it immediately sets up your audience to follow where you are so that you know your audience can see where you're going. You can do this live quite easily by extemporizing and by saying next up, next thing, but you can't do that if you've pre-recorded it, and it's often hard to spot your audience if that's gone awry for you. So I'd strongly recommend something like a progress bar. I actually am going to put a link in the chat as well to a pre-recorded presentation which I did a few months ago. Excuse me one moment, I can't share everything at once. I'm going to put a link in the chat to a pre-recorded presentation that I did a few months ago, which took this one step further and actually had a live bar going along the bottom of the screen that tracked with it. The way you do that is you have an object on the screen, you animate it so it moves across and gets to the end at the end of the video. That's quite technical. So even if that's not really something that you're in a position to do, I would strongly recommend that you try putting in a progress bar of some description to show where you are. Another point to make about this presentation, apart from the progress bar, Rosie, no worries. Thanks very much for coming. Yeah, to be fair, Benedict, they can look forward to the end as well. That's entirely fair. I think there's another point which is worth noting. Apart from that, pictures. I'm lucky. The thing that I study is medieval manuscripts, so I have lots and lots and lots of pretty pictures. This does mean that my file sizes are enormous. So this is the low res version, as you may be able to see. It's 40 megabytes, but it's well worth it. Another point to make, at this point in my presentation, you're gonna have to imagine I'm midway through it. Here's what I said this morning. Now, at this point, I should point out, some of you may have noticed point 9 on this list of contents here. With characteristic confidence by our editor, it says some red things. And I would like to just share with you the reaction of our cat, Mina, when she saw that. And you move on. That's perhaps proof, as was being said earlier, that comedy helps, although I think it's also proof that you don't need to be funny in order to make jokes, as I've proven here. But if you look through these slides, as a general rule, I'm not saying these slides are perfect, far from it, but as a general rule, there's not a huge amount of reliance on text read from a screen. It's a combination of reading, of working from images and the way in which you deliver your presentation. So I mentioned here in this example, what's going on. We've got on this progress bar several steps. The way that I chose to do it is we have 2 shades of red, then 3 different types of text. So the text that's the bit that's currently in focus, you've got the bold for how far along we are, and then the white text for what's currently being discussed, and then grayed out what's been discussed already. There are different options for this. Just going to switch over here. Bear with me one moment. So this is what that presentation from a few months ago looked like. So you can see along the bottom, we've got the same thing here. That is actually, because I did this later in my editing software, that is, they do correspond to how far along we are. They're not equally spaced out, those sections. But what that meant is, when I was designing the slides look like this. So when you're doing things like, if you're doing picture-in-picture, either through OBS, which is the software I mentioned in just a second, or through something like a different video editor, you need to think about the space you're going to leave at the bottom of your slides. I've experimented in the past. You can also, and this works quite well on wide screens, have the progress bar, if you like, down the side on the left. But this all really comes back to the same thing, which is support your audience, guide your audience, turn off notifications before you start presenting at a conference. That was my third part. Support your audience, guide your audience, and make sure that they're your friend. Claire has just put in a useful link there, how to create a progress bar in PowerPoint. I've always done it sort of in a slightly sort of roundabout way. But yes, I can see you can do it with macros. That's a neat little tip, actually. As I say, my way was something of a workaround, which involved creating a shape and then moving it across as the presentation continued. But it all comes back to the same thing, which is to support your audience. So we've talked thus far a bit, and I've heard some really, really cool stuff about how we can make ourselves ready for presentations, how we can help our audience, and how we can overcome some of the limitations, I think, of digital conferences. But we've also talked a bit about some of the benefits of it. What might a digital conference allow you to do that, say, an in-person one might limit you about? What might some of the advantages be of a digital conference like this one? Okay, Benedict, yes. You can go in your pajamas. Very true. When you say what conferences to go to internationally, can I ask what you mean by that, Tiamat?
Well, just instead of traveling there, you can just get to them virtually.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes. So yeah, travel is no longer an issue. Yeah, absolutely. And that might have implications, of course, for your audience. You know, a conference like Medieval French Without Borders was very specific, but there were people who attended who would not have been able to attend had it been in person. So you need to scope out your audience, I think. That's one thing I'd take away from this today, and make sure that you know. Reducing cost, yeah, absolutely, Cassandra, very, very valid point there too, I think as well. I'm conscious that things have been a little bit sort of slapdash today. That's partly because I couldn't share my do breakout rooms in the way I wanted to, and partly because there's been so much cool stuff coming from people. I have a few other points to make. One of them is regarding blended conferences, which are, I think, becoming more and more frequent. So is anyone not familiar with what I mean by a blended conference? They're sometimes also called hybrid conferences, particularly if you're French. Just in case anyone's unaware, blended conferences are where presentations can be, people can either be in the room or they can be online. I haven't done one myself. Has anyone done a blended conference recently? I'm curious to know whether kind of, if you were in the room at a blended conference, you felt like there was, pre-pandemic, yeah. So Tiamat, can I ask you, did you feel there was a difference between being, I'm assuming you were in the room for that one, and there were just people coming in. Could you feel a difference in the vibe in the room versus people Skyping in?
Yeah, I also think it would be cool to see how it is now after we've all had this sort of crash course in virtual conferences, because at the time it was like the connection was really bad and then we couldn't get them to kind of get going. That took about 20-30 minutes. And I'll take your tip about turning off notifications. And so that was like a whole thing that kind of made it a bit of a drag. But I think maybe after the pandemic, that could go a lot smoother.
One of the reasons I haven't spoken too much yet, well, today, about things like how to have good audio is because I know that Tom Nicholas, who knows far more about creating video than I ever did, and to be fair, a lot of Tom's techniques that he was talking about in his panel will be very useful to you in creating things like asynchronous video. So if you're sending something off to a conference. But one thing I will say with respect to the difficulties of presenting online is if you can secure a good internet connection, it's so worth it, because one of the major benefits of in-person conferences, which we haven't addressed yet, is what almost starts buffering that action is lost. Human sacrifices, none of which is really ideal for anybody. That last point was a joke. Yeah. So when the connection starts buffering, like I pretended it was buffering there. Thanks for playing along at home, Wayne. That's something which is incredibly irritating. There's nothing you can really do about it. So if you can get hold of a good connection, particularly a wired one, so I'm on campus for this exercise today, it's definitely worth doing that. If you can't, then it's what you can look into, seeing if you could pre-record your presentation and send that over. If you've been accepted to a conference, I don't foresee any major issues in that, and it might be worth considering if that's an option, pre-recording it if your connection to the internet is terrible. But a lot of what Tom has said about recording video, about having a separate microphone if you can, which I know is something that he mentioned, something that Merva also spoke about in her session on podcasting, are really, really worth bearing in mind. I want to leave a bit of time at the end today for questions, and I'm conscious we've jumped around an awful lot over the last hour. I hope it's been useful to think about. The four things I wanted to get across today, just to kind of recap slightly. The first is to think about why you're presenting, what you're hoping to get out of it. So if you're presenting to a group of non-experts, that has a different style to it. To present to a group of experts, you won't be able to test your more, I'm going to make a massive generalization here and say you won't be able to test your more specific conclusions. But if you're presenting to non-experts, yeah, Sarah, I'll come to that in a second if that's okay. If you're presenting to non-experts and you've got potential to ask more methodological questions, which might seem obvious to other people, but I've found that talking to non-experts can be really helpful, for example, for thinking through the introduction to my thesis. How do you lead a reader into it? It's exactly what you've got to do in a conference paper. Second big idea for me today was conferences are not book chapters. And I think a lot of the things that irritate us in conferences come from people ignoring that and reading aloud what would effectively be a book chapter. It's something you have to practice, and it's difficult, actually. The link that I've put in the chat a while ago to one of my presentations will hopefully be useful in that respect. The third point was support your audience, and that's something that I've tried to get across. The main thing there is the idea of the progress bar. That was a very specific thing about slide design for integrated video. You can do that in several ways. One of them is by making your PowerPoints accessible and reducing the reliance on slides. I would also suggest, if you want to start doing things like playing around with putting other things in your live video, you investigate the various tools that are available. One which I was using, which has actually been slightly temperamental today, unusually, is called OBS. I will put the link to that in the chat now. That is open broadcasting software, to use the technical term. It allows it to look like you're sharing your screen, but you're actually using a virtual camera. Here's a link, here's the discussion to it. If you just search OBS, you'll find it. A couple of other things to note. First one is that a lot of excellent resources are becoming available on the university's website at the moment. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the research and development team and what they do. I can see a few people nodding. They have some excellent resources that are produced by PGRs for PGRs, and Beth Mills, who's a PGR in humanities, is currently working on the How to Make the Most of Conferences resource, which talks about both in-person and digital ones. It's a bit broader, and it talks about things like networking we've not had the time to get into today, but there's some excellent stuff in there that will go live very shortly. I'm doing one on the Viva, incidentally, if anyone is coming up to that. Can I just jump back to what that wonderful point that Claire mentioned? Sorry, Sarah mentioned, sorry, inclusivity of online resources. I'd love to see that link if you've got it, Sarah, somewhere. I think I may have come across it before. The one thing we have to bear in mind is things like screen fatigue, which is a real thing for me. It's one of the reasons I've not used too many slides today, so that you can look off into the middle distance. Blog post, yeah, if you will be able to find it, Sarah, that would be wonderful. The final thing I want to make a point about today is a question that I've been asked in the past. Surprisingly fun to say that I've been asked in the past, relating to what scripts should look like. Out of curiosity, could you put your hand up, please, if you read from a script when you're presenting at a conference? Okay. And can you put your hand up if you think you should read from a script when you're presenting at a conference? This is interesting. Loads of people expect me to say, that have expected me in the past to say, you should never read from a script. This is what my script looks like. It's really entirely up to you. The important thing is whatever you do, that you're not like this. So my solution, and this is another sort of simple thing you can try, is to take my presentation, write out a script with a couple of kind of dots in it to expound upon, but to blow it up to, I think this is size 23 or something like that. Yeah, reading from script's good for short presentations, I'd agree there as well. But anything where you want to follow a structure and not ramble, which I tend to do anyway. I've also, you can probably just see there, there we go, put a little note to myself to click through to the next slide. And I've incorporated my own headings in here as well. I actually did the headings last. I went back and edited it and put those in and realized where the headers naturally fell. Yeah, Sarah's made a good point. She she likes a script, but she can use it fluidly. I would agree there. Notes in PowerPoint and presenter view, yes, all of this works. Whether you are pre-recording, whether you are doing the standard Zoom screen share function, or anything in between, being familiar with what you're saying, but not so familiar that there's no extemporization is, I think, a really valuable skill to develop. We've gone around the houses in the last hour, I think, talked about a lot of different things, and I've really enjoyed hearing what you guys have got to say. I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. So does anyone have anything, or is there anything that they feel like we haven't discussed that you'd like to look at in a little bit more detail? We've been quite specific to online in some cases, I know. I hope that kind of matrix of in-person, remote versus synchronous, asynchronous is a useful conceptualization for you. And I hope that some of the other elements have been handy too. But do we have any, that's quite all right, Sarah, no worries. Do we have any other questions or any other thoughts that we'd like to raise before we finish? Feel free to just take a moment to gather your thoughts. I think the main thing to take away from today, because this is primarily geared at setting you up for October, isn't it? Is that right, Benedict? Yeah. Is to think really carefully about who your audience is going to be. I've always said you only really have time for one big idea in a 20-minute presentation. And many problems come from trying to squeeze too much in. Oh, Rebecca, that's so kind. Thank you. I felt like I was going around the houses a bit. Many of the problems come from trying to squeeze way too much in. But if you can learn that early and learn not to do that, you're in a really, really good place. You're going to be speaking to presumably non-specialists, so you can't, particularly if you're at an early stage in your PhD, you can't jump straight in with understandings of anthropological XYZism. But think about what a more general audience can offer you. What can you get out of speaking to interested non-experts? And that's all I've got for you today. Feel free to get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. I'm happy to talk about any questions you might have regarding OBS as well, or kind of any of the more specific digital things as well. Thanks so much for having me. It's been really fun talking to you guys and hearing what you guys have been up to.
Ed, thanks so much for coming. That was such a fabulous talk. I didn't think the 8th hour of an 8-hour day was going to be the most fun, but it is the most fun I've had all day. It was great.
Thank you. I like to bring the bounce. Sometimes that comes at the expense of actual content, but I think I managed to fill that gap today by relying on everyone here and how phenomenally well informed you already were.
Yeah, oh, thank you so much. That's a great way to wrap up the day, and it really kind of tied up everything that we'd heard all day. Really nice, and just a positive vibe as well. Such a nice thing to do. Yeah, a round of applause for Ed from everybody. Virtual applause.